Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vivek Kakar, and I am a Dean Student Ambassador at the UC Riverside School of Public Policy, as well as the founding executive director of the Roosevelt Network chapter at UCR. I am delighted to serve as your host today for this online seminar with our special guest, Dr. Natwar Gandhi. We will devote the first 30 minutes of today's webinar to a presentation by our guest speaker. We will then reserve the last half hour of today's event for an audience Q&A. For that Q&A, I have also invited a few of my public policy classmates to ask questions on camera directly to our guest. Audience members, if you have any questions you would like me to pose during the Q&A session, please do not send them via the chat, but rather send them using the Q&A feature, which you will find at the bottom of your screens. You can submit your questions anytime throughout the event via the Q&A feature. You do not have to wait until the audience Q&A portion of today's event to send in your questions. At this point, I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Natwar Gandhi retired in January 2014 from his long-tenured position as Independent Chief Financial Officer, or CFO, of the District of Columbia, where he was responsible for Washington, D.C.'s finances, including its approximately $12 billion in annual operating and capital funds. As the independent CFO, he managed the district's financial operations, including more than 1,200 staff members. During Dr. Gandhi's tenure as CFO, the district was transformed from a deficit-plagued, junk bond-rated jurisdiction with a $550 million negative fund balance into a financially healthy municipality with a string of balanced budgets and a fund balance of $1.5 billion by the end of 2013. From 2014 to 2016, Dr. Gandhi was a distinguished policy fellow at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business. Presently, he consults with the World Bank in its efforts to create financially sustainable cities around the world. He holds a doctorate in accounting from Louisiana State University, a master's degree in business administration from Atlanta University, and a bachelor's of commerce and bachelor of legislative law in accounting from the University of Bombay. Lastly, he is the author of Still the Promised Land, which my fellow classmate Uthman will share a link to in the chat. Dr. Gandhi, we are so honored to have you with us today. I'll go ahead and hand it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Vivek, for your kind introduction. I also want to thank Dean Anil Devlalikar, Dr. Ariel Diner, and Mark Manalang for organizing this event. I'm grateful to them all. I feel privileged to be a part of the UCR's School of Public Policy seminar series that once had included former Labor Secretary Robert Reich, among many other dignitaries. I like the school's motto, solutions for the region, solutions for the world. It reflects the wisdom of an ancient Indian saying, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. This means that the whole world is one family. If nothing else, the looming catastrophe of climate change proves how well the school is focused on the issues that matter regionally and also matter globally. As Vivek pointed out, this afternoon, I'll speak for about 30 minutes and then open up for comments, questions, and conversation. I want to talk first about immigration and relate it to my personal story, as well as to the larger story of the emergence of Indian Americans in contemporary America. Then I'll briefly talk about the role I played in the rejuvenation of the finances in Washington, D.C. First, let us talk about my personal story. I'm an immigrant, and with a name like Gandhi, you can easily surmise that I'm from India. When I came to this country in 1965, I had only $7 on me. That was it, just $7. I was among the tired and the poor and the wretched that Emma Lazarus wrote about in her famous poem that is inscribed in the inside wall of Statue of Liberty. The point that I'm trying to make here is this. From that humble beginning, I rose to be the chief financial officer of the nation's capital and played a key role in salvaging Washington, D.C. from its financial ruin. Actually, imagine this. I'm an Asian immigrant with an accent and still had extraordinary powers as CFO of the nation's capital, only in America. America gave me a chance to remake my life that would have been vested in India. Let me tell you a little of that life. I grew up in a large extended family that included my parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, siblings. It was in a primitive little place in Western India that had no running water. I still remember my mother and sisters drinking water from the town river, no electricity. I studied under a kerosene lamp, no paved street, no telephone, of course. There were no cars either. There was a train that would come once a day, often late. When I was 17, my father put me on that train to go to Mumbai and make some money and send it to him. I was a failure in Mumbai, where I could not find a good enough job to make a living or afford housing. I had to send my newly wedded wife to our hometown to live with my parents. I ate at a community kitchen and slept in the place where I worked. When my wife came to Mumbai to live with me, we had no permanent housing. We moved from place to place every 3 months, not knowing where we would go next. It was a nomadic, miserable experience. Seeing no hope, I thought my only salvation was to go to America. But thinking of going to America and actually going there were two different things. One needs a lot of money to go to America. I had no money. But a college friend who had already gone to America took pity on me. He arranged a scholarship fund and, wonder of wonders, also an airline ticket through an educational foundation. Those were the glory days of higher education in America. In essence, my coming to America was nothing short of a miracle. Life in India, particularly in Mumbai, was horrendous and hopeless. But I was extraordinarily lucky. I was able to come to America and make something of myself. In return, I hope I have become a productive and a contributing citizen. But in this, I'm not alone. There are hundreds of thousands of Indian immigrants like me. They possess a dazzling array of professional skills and an abundance of entrepreneurial zeal. They are among the most highly educated minorities in America. 70% of Indian Americans are college educated. With this level of education, they can be found excelling in every field from accounting to zoology and everything in between. Some of them have already achieved international recognition. All Indian Nobel laureates over the last 40 years in the field of science and economics have hailed from the United States. Indeed, I would hazard a guess that future Indian Nobel laureates will likely emerge from the United States. It is hard to find a hospital without an Indian doctor, an engineering firm without an Indian engineer, a highway without an Indian-run motel, a town without an Indian store, or a university without an Indian professor. Right here at the School of Public Policy, you have two distinguished academicians, Dean Duality and Professor Karthik Ramakrishnan. One can seldom open a professional journal without seeing an article written by an Indian academic. Lately, one can hardly watch a TV program on COVID-19 without listening to an Indian doctor. Economic achievement of Indian Americans are so extraordinary that they are now considered among the top 1% of American population. Presently, there are about 200,000 Indian Americans who are millionaires in the United States. The latest Forbes magazine list of 400 wealthiest American billionaires, and it has 9 Indian Americans, including 2 Indian women. This is the story of the first generation. The second generation include children who reign supreme in spelling bee and win Westinghouse and other prestigious scholarships. Among the adult children of first generation, there are legislators and policymakers at all levels of government, including the Vice President of the United States. They have had among them congressmen, cabinet members, senators, governors, ambassadors, and NASA engineers who contributed to the recent space adventure on Mars. They have also excelled in arts, culture, literature, with several claiming Oscars and Pulitzer Prizes and other awards. President Biden had named at least 50 Indian Americans for a variety of key positions relating to national security, climate change, technology, finance, economics, White House personnel, and the press operations. In this group, there are 13 women, a new record in itself for the small ethnic community that constitutes only about 1% of country's population. As many as 17 of them would be part of the powerful White House complex, including Vinay Reddy, who authored President Biden's first State of the Union speech. Topping the list was Neera Tanden, who was nominated as Director of the Office of Management and Budget, which is among the most powerful federal agencies. Unfortunately, Republican senators sabotaged her nomination. Other nominees, of whom many are already confirmed, include Dr. Vivek Murthy as the US Surgeon General, Vanita Gupta as Associate Attorney General, and Rohit Chopra as the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and Kiran Ahuja to head the Office of Personnel Management. Given this record of success, Indian American as well as other immigrants, I firmly believe that a continuous and judicious flow of immigration is good for the country. Particularly more working age younger immigrants are needed. With a declining fertility, America is about to face an aging crisis. About 10,000 baby boomers retire each day. Quality of life of this aging, shrinking population increasingly depends on 2 factors: sustained high fertility among minority groups already in the country and continued immigration. What is more, if the US is to maintain its competitive edge, it will have to let in more highly skilled immigrants. Similarly, at the other end of the spectrum, the US also needs immigrants to work in fields, farms, factories, fisheries, slaughterhouses, restaurants, and in construction, where there is an acute shortage of people willing to work long hours in difficult conditions. Only immigrants would do that kind of hard labor. Some fear that too many third world immigrants would put American democracy in danger. It should be noted, however, that approximately 150 years ago, the same warnings were heard about the Jews, Italians, Poles, who were arriving on American shores by the millions. Even at the founding of the Republic, Benjamin Franklin had raised similar concerns about German immigrants. Further, the number of foreign-born residents in the United States is now the highest it has been since 1910. Presently, 43 million immigrants who are mostly from Asia, Africa, and Latin America constitute nearly 13% of the US population. With their US-born children in equal numbers, they constitute nearly a quarter of the total population. Thus, the country has already moved forward, and the demographic reality is that America is well on its way to be the most diverse majority-minority country within the next few decades. Yes, assimilation of first-generation immigrants, no matter where they come from, is nearly always difficult. But for their second and third generation and beyond, Americanization is a foregone conclusion. The melting pot works. I see this firsthand in my own family. My children and grandchildren are American first and Indian second. They have more in common with their American friends next door than with their cousins in India. Yes, they do not look like Americans of European descent, but their values and concept of liberty, manners, and mores are the same as those of Americans who trace their ancestry to Europe. For the immigrant with skills, America is heaven. If you know what you want to do with your life and are willing to work at it, America is still the place to come. This nation's generous people open their hearts and doors to immigrants like me and let them pursue their dreams. And that is why America is the most favorite destination for tens of millions around the world. The best and the brightest, as well as the tired and the poor, come to America, invited or not. My story is both cautionary and instructive, difficult yet uplifting. Ultimately, it is a harrowing tale of how to survive in India and succeed in America. It was an uncertain beginning, in some ways even more difficult than the immigrants face today. In this winter of American discontent, when a presidential candidate rode into the White House with his anti-immigrant rant, it is rather quaint to say, as I do, America is still the promised land. In singing America's glory, I'm not ignoring what is bad and ugly here. Guns, violence, drugs, social promiscuity, racial discrimination, economic disparity, erosion of the middle class, and above all, its highly polarized tribal politics. And yes, I too feel the sting of discrimination. Crank calls from crazies come telling me to go back home. But where would I go? After being here for 50 some years, this is my home, now and forever. Most Americans take their country for granted. I don't. I know better. I am from the old world, where America is still the place to go. I'm a citizen now and celebrate July 4th. But the day of my biggest celebration is October 10th. On that day in 1965, I landed in America. That is my Independence Day. Now, I will turn to the role I played in the financial rejuvenation of Washington, D.C. When I joined the city in 1997, it had roughly $535 million deficit in its fund balance, as you can see in the chart here. It had a hard time meeting its payroll. Creditors were routinely asked to wait to be paid. Vendors were hesitant to provide essential services for fear of not getting paid. They knew that the city was broke. When I retired as its longest serving CFO in late 2013, Washington had about $1.5 billion surplus in its fund balance. Before the pandemic hit the city hard, its fund balance was a healthy $2.7 billion. The city's bonds that were once considered junk are now rated AAA. Today, the district has balanced its budget consistently since 1997, the year in which I joined the city. It has a welcome presence on Wall Street, where it was once a pariah. It has the reputation of being financially responsible and fiscally prudent. All this would not have been possible, of course, without the visionary leadership of Mayor Anthony Williams and the financial discipline imposed by congressionally imposed control board. How was such a profound financial transformation possible? During the 1970s and 80s and 90s, many large American cities faced severe financial strife. Middle class flight to the suburbs eroded the tax base. The cities had to provide for a large number of the poor who had been left behind. New York City and Philadelphia are but two examples of how once great cities fell into such a financial strife. Their respective states established control boards to manage the deteriorating financial situation. Washington faced a similar financial crisis, the exception being that it had no state to look after it. Since the Congress is essentially the city's guardian, it followed what New York and Pennsylvania did and established a control board. What is more, it created a powerful office of the independent chief financial officer, making the CFO essentially the city's financial czar, who was responsible for assuring the city's financial viability. Anthony A. Williams was the district's first such CFO, and when he became its mayor, I followed him in that position. As the district's longest serving chief financial officer, I have seen both the bad times and good times. So what did we do to bring back the district from its disastrous financial situation to its present fiscal strength? There was no particular magic, just simple common sense. With the control board's help and support, and a few courageous leaders on the Hill and in the city, we implemented certain basic rules. The district would not spend more than what it took in, and only the CFO would estimate how much revenue will flow in. No rosy scenarios there. The CFO assures a balanced budget, not only for the current fiscal year, but also for a 5-year period, and monitors both expenditures and revenues throughout the year to see if any modifications are needed to assure a balanced budget at the year's end. Further, only the CFO does the borrowing to assure that it can pay back what it borrows. The bottom line is measured borrowing, realistic budgeting, and no deficits, period. These were straightforward but harsh measures that required radical restructuring of the district's spending habits. It is easier to say than done. For the district, it was a bitter medicine, but it worked. Let me stop right here and invite questions, comments, observations from the participants. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gandhi, for your inspirational presentation. As a member of the South Asian community myself, I am proud to hear your story and your acknowledgement of our contribution that our shared community has made to the larger American culture. It's such an important reminder, so thank you for that. At this time, we will now transition to our audience Q&A. Just a quick reminder to those in our audience to please submit your questions via the Q&A box instead of the chat function. I'll be posing your questions to Dr. Gandhi. Additionally, I would like to introduce my fellow classmates who are now joining me on camera: Ebony Odur, Rayan Kalam, and Uthman Alawi. They will pose questions directly to Dr. Gandhi throughout the next 30 minutes as well. The first question will be for myself. Dr. Gandhi, you had mentioned in your speech that your children and grandchildren are American first and Indian second. What advice do you have for the young and future generations trying to strike a balance between their Desi and American culture?
Well, I think more than the advice, as I said in my presentation, the American melting pot works. Moment a child starts seeing Sesame Street on television, when very young, the Americanization begins. Then in the neighborhood, and then in the schools. So the acculturation into American mores and values is happening all the time. But at the same time, what matters is a sense of belonging. And sense of belonging is for them to America. Yes, they are American Indians, no doubt about that. I should say Indian Americans. But at the end of the day, they are American first. Their identity is American. And all the things that are more natural to me and my generation, things of Indian origin, basically are foreign to them. They are more at ease with their neighborhood friends, school friends, than their cousins in India. So my suggestion is that one should belong to the region, the area where we are. And that is one of the great American virtue that, and this was characterized and mentioned by Alexis de Tocqueville, the great writer who wrote a seminal book on American democracy called Democracy in America. And he said that what matters in America is the local initiative, local municipality, local government, neighborhood association. So to solve the problems in America, we don't look to Washington. And I'm not saying anything new when I say Washington is broken. What we have is American initiative that is local. So advice, if I have any for my children and grandchildren, is to belong to where you are from. That is from San Francisco, from Washington, elsewhere in the country. So that is where you belong.
Thank you so much. Our next question is from Uthman, and he'll be posing it himself.
Hello, I just want to say thank you for the great presentation. I'd like to springboard my question off what you just recently stated, in that having the experience with being in a smaller community in rural India and then going to Mumbai and then eventually the United States, what would you say that is either both your favorite and least favorite parts of experiencing both very rural communities as well as big urban and industrialized interconnected cities?
As I mentioned in my opening, the life that I led in India, both in a very small town and also in Mumbai, it was fundamentally a different life, very hard, very trying time of my life, and transformation from my small town, village actually, to Mumbai was a greater transformation than coming from Mumbai to America. This is the first time when I able to ride in a car, have electricity, running water, Mumbai. Because Mumbai is a major city. So once you come to this country, life becomes very easy, really. There are no day-to-day pressures of living that one finds in India, and they are absent in America. One doesn't have to worry here about water. In general, you open a bathroom and run the faucet and the water comes out. And generally, it's drinkable water, barring few cases. But in generally, we have much cleaner air. And just by being in this country, you have advantages that you don't have in a place like India or smaller places. For example, better roads, libraries, parks, schools. All these things are given to you just because you are here. So my sense here is that what one should do is to exploit all these advantages to one's own advantage. And if we were to waste that opportunity, then I think it's a bad news. And I'm sorry to say that we are not really exploiting the advantage that an affluent society gives you. If anything, we waste those opportunities. And I think the challenge to all of us in public policy, and after all, you all will be going to, to manage cities, states, federal government, embassies, etc., that you need the skills that basically capitalizes on the advantages that we have here. I'm repeating myself, but the problems that we face in poorest of the poor in countries, third world countries, are sometimes existential problems. And one really has to be very, very careful in terms of how one lives one's life in those areas. And we don't have to worry about those problems. And so let us, of course, we should enjoy the benefits of affluence that the country provides, but at the same time, we should exploit the opportunity and enhance our potential. That is very, very important.
Thank you so much for that answer, Dr. Gandhi. So we are joined by our Dean, Dean Anil Dialalekar, and he's also, as well as our Dean, he's a professor of economics. So he's asked a question that I'm going to pose to you now. How much were DC's financial solvency problems the result of white flight to the suburbs of Virginia and Maryland that occurred in the 1960s and the 70s in many American cities? Or were these problems the result of financial mismanagement over the years?
Both, and I'm very pleased to say hello to Dean Dialalekar. I'm pleased that he is here, and he knows this better than perhaps all of us put together. But both of these factors are critical. City was mismanaged, no doubt about that. But even if we were to manage it properly, efficiently, we still would have had problems. For example, let's give you an example of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. basically, as we know, is a district. It has no congressional representation. Any city, to run properly, it has to have an adequate tax base. Our tax base is rather structured, narrow, and limited. What do I mean by that? Well, during the daytime, city's population doubles, meaning that people come from suburbs, Maryland and Virginia, to work there. And in the evening, they go back home. The money that is earned, income that is earned in the district is not taxed in the district, but taxed in Maryland and Virginia. This is the only place in the world where income is not taxed where it is earned. And that is a major problem for us. If you are managing the city, the question is, you have to take care of the poor. For example, Washington, despite all its affluence, despite the federal government, federal bureaucracy, 1/3 of its population, roughly 200,000 people, are on Medicaid. That means they're very poor. Now, so by not being able to tax people who work there, we lose that income tax further, or the commuter tax, because if you work in Philadelphia or in New York, and if you're New Jersey residents, you pay taxes in Philadelphia and New York. Now, in addition, we have international institutions like World Bank, IMF, embassies. They do not pay any tax. Further, universities don't pay any tax. Churches don't pay any taxes. So two of the largest employers in the city do not pay any tax whatever. So the question for us is, what do you do? How do you raise revenue to take care of cities' needs, particularly cities' poor? Well, once we find a taxpayer, we never let him go. We keep piling on. And that is why our tax rates has been among the highest in the country, and we cannot compete with surrounding jurisdiction, Montgomery County, Fairfax County in Virginia. Those are first-rate counties, but they have our tax dollars, and they basically would never let that go. So, and in Congress, since we have no representation, there is nothing you can do about it. So that's a fundamental. So narrow, restricted tax base is a problem. Now, on the top of it, and Dean Duality is exactly right, we had very bad financial management for roughly 10 years or so, but they were forced to do that. And the last thing we do basically is when you don't have tax base, we don't have enough revenue, then you won't borrow money. So we started borrowing. So per capita, we have the highest debt per capita in the country. And we cannot afford to pay the debt services. And that's how we were pushed into junk bond territory, and because we developed deficits. And towards mid-90s, it came to a situation where city basically was broke. It had no cash whatever. GAO, then the General Accounting Office, had done a study for the Congress and said, city has no cash. And Congress, since it is responsible for the city under the Constitution, simply imposed a control board and say, look, we're going to take away city's financial management from its elected leadership, mayor and the council, put it under the control board and the independent chief financial officer, whom we make responsible for maintaining city's financial viability. And as a CFO, that was the primary responsibility that I had. Make sure that city remains financially viable. What does that mean? That means no deficits, whatever. The day I go before the Congress and say, I have a deficit, I'm out of job. Or rating, as I mentioned, where basically junk bond rating, and we had to steadily improve that. And as I mentioned, that city had to take some extreme measures, reduce our payroll, and make sure that we pay our bills. It took us roughly 10 years to rise up from where we were. And now, because of the independent chief financial officer, he or she controls the spending, raises the revenue, estimates the revenue, and only person to borrow money for the city. Because of all these constraining factors, city remains financially viable, and prosperous. So I maintain as long as there is an independent CFO in the city will always remain financially viable.
Thank you, Dr. Gandhi, for your answer, and thank you, Dean Dialalakar, for your question. Next up is Rayan Kalam. He'd like to pose a question.
Thank you, Dr. Gandhi, for your inspiring story and able to see an immigrant come from a country and have roughly nothing and make it so far is truly the American dream. But I just wanted to ask you, and I know you mentioned assimilation in your speech for new Desi Americans coming into the United States. So I just wanted to ask, as far as how we can stay more cultured to where we came from and being so less forgive me for the term, but whitewashed, then how would we stay to our roots and be more active and even give back to where we came?
That's a very good question. And the children of first generation immigrants face this issue, and grandchildren as well. But first generation children have this profound problem. Those who are born here and raised here, they have this duality. And for example, in our own case, Indian case, children basically live a bifurcated life. At home, they are in India. Moment you step out, you are in America. I'm sure Vivek knows this, that Indians basically are Indians at home. The same mores, same attitudes. But moment you step out, you are in America. Basically, the first generation immigrants like myself, we are what I would call 9 to 5 Americans. We go to work, dress properly, do our work, come back home and become Indian. Now, it was all right that we could do that because we had roots in India and we behave like Indians at home. But that would not be possible for my children and grandchildren because they would be married to Americans or Indian Americans, and they would expect the attitude and the behavior of your spouses that are American. So the way I would behave with my wife or my children is different than my children would behave with my grandchildren if they are Americanized. So it's like being a sleepwalker. You move from one place to the next. And children are very good at that, very, very good at that. They know how to maneuver, they know how to leverage. At the same time, the first generation Indian immigrants bring strength to the family. To first generation, particularly those who come from traditional societies, family is an extremely important institution. I know people who would work 2 jobs, sometimes 3 jobs, to make sure that the child goes to the best possible schools. Many of them had come here not well educated, like myself. Those who came in 60s, they were very, very well educated, professional degrees, doctors, lawyers, engineers. But those who followed were not educated. Like my, this would give a heart attack to Mr. Trump. I had 14 people came to our house from India overnight. That I sponsored them. They came, all right? That every Indian does, basically bring in their family here. So those who came, they were not educated at all. But as soon as they came, they started working. Next week, they were working at Jerry's and McDonald's and Burger King's, those who were not educated. And all of us lived together. So our children had to give up their rooms because after all, we have to make room for 14 people. And so the question then was, how do you manage this dichotomy? The reason it has to be managed well is the family, because you don't abandon your family. You take care of your family. So I hate to put it this way, but it's very rare to see an Indian homeless, primarily because not that all of them are doing very, very well financially, no, but family takes care of them. We are not left to deal with ourselves, thrown out of the house, no. The parents, brothers, sister will take care. And family is the fundamental strength of this community, of anybody who comes from traditional societies. So I think it is something that one needs to, again, exploit. The advantage we need to exploit, that they would go any length to take care of children, no matter how old they are, no matter what kind of problem they are in. But at the end of the day, every generation has to go through this issue of Americanization. And as I mentioned, my children, they look like me, they name like Apurva or Vivek, they're Indian names, but they're Americans. And then their children, again, with Indian names, but they're all Americans. They're all Americans. And last thing I would say in this country is that this is the only country that adapts. Very few countries have this great strength of adaptation. Chinese would remain Chinese, French would remain French, no matter what happens. But America changes. Imagine another few decades, this will be a Hispanic country. We change our characters. And that is a major strength. And that is why people want to come here. We get opportunities here. I tell, no matter how high a wall you put up, people will come, no matter what. Because one, immigrants, despite all the difficulties, find opportunities in this country. And two, we think things are bad here, they are worse outside. So my sense here is that we will have to manage our immigration very well. And those who are already here, this whole issue of how to culturate ourselves into American mainstream, that is the challenge that we have to adapt.
Thank you, Dr. Gandhi, for that answer. Real quickly on this topic, we have a question from the audience. Do you believe that the efforts that schools and universities are currently making in regards to promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion will change and strengthen the identity of second and third generation immigrant families away from the American first assimilation?
I think, as I point out, the melting pot works. And no matter how hard we try to remain distinct and different, it's not going to work going forward into future generations. Because the values, the mores, the manners in a country like America absorbs you. Melting pot absorbs you. So I show all the distinctive characteristics of an Indian. But that goes away with the second generation and the third generation. Now, that doesn't mean that we ought to dilute the diversity. Indeed, to use the cliche, diversity is our strength. It is our major strength. Imagine just recently, Nobel Prizes were announced. 7 Nobel Prizes went to Americans. 6 of them went to immigrants. Imagine that. And if you look at the longer perspective, say over last 21 years since 2000, roughly 40% of Nobel Prizes went to immigrants. Americans, but immigrants. I mentioned that all the 5 Nobel laureates, Indian Nobel laureates, came from this country, not from India. So all this diversity is critical for this country and is a major strength. But let us not forget that at the end of the day, Americanization is a steamrollers and basically makes you American. And we have no choice but to get used to that, while at the same time trying to retain our inner strength as a community. And for example, to my mind, Jews are an excellent example of how one maintains a tradition. No matter where they go in the world, they always remain essentially Jews in their heritage, in their culture. But that doesn't mean they are less of Americans. They are Americans. And that's a model that is followed by many, many people. But we should always remember that at the end of the day, we are all Americans. At the same time, trying to maintain our distinct identity. And let us not be like other countries that do not adapt, they do not change. No, America will always keep changing. And that's its strength.
Thank you so much. The next question, and to the audience, feel free to continue to submit your questions to the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. The next question comes from Mr. Manalang. He would like to ask that in your book, you mentioned that it was a dream of yours to be influential in Washington and play a role in public policy. Could you talk about the first time you felt you had influenced policy?
Right. I think coming to America is a dream for all the people out there in India and elsewhere. And it was my dream as well. But coming to America to make money was not the part of my makeup. What I really wanted to do was to be involved in public policy. And even after coming to America, I came in 1965, but I came to Washington in 1977. So all the time while I was in America, my eyes were towards Washington. As I pointed out, the first ever trip that I took in the car that I bought was to Washington. And again in Washington, I wanted to involve in policy. So when I had opportunities to work at several places, I chose General Accounting Office, GAO, where as an accountant, I would have more of a leverage. And also GAO gets involved in the entire federal government. And there I basically got involved in taxation. And through sheer accident, people on the Hill were trying to organize, rationalize taxation of insurance companies. Now, in my life as an accountant, I have seen many complex and boring things. Insurance takes the cake. It's so complex, taxation of insurance industry. But by using their complexity, they were avoiding paying taxes. So I studied insurance taxation. I worked closely with Senate Finance Committee, at that time chaired by Senator Dole, and House Ways and Means Committee, at that time chaired by Congressman Ross Gronkowski of Illinois. And working with those committees, we rationalized taxation of insurance industry and raised $7 billion. So that's why one of the chapters of my book says $7 billion. And I was known as kind of a $7 billion man in that agency because being able to raise that level of taxation. And with that level of experience and auditing IRS, I was then invited to head the tax office management. Tax office in Washington, as I pointed out in the book, was broken. And that is part of the comment that Dean Duality made, that was very basically mismanaged. Primary function of a tax agency is to collect taxes. Well, records were so broken, so inadequate, missing, that we could never collect taxes. Now, if you are Washington residents, you pay taxes to IRS like everybody else, and you pay taxes to the district government. You must pay taxes to IRS because if they didn't, then they go after you. If you didn't pay taxes to district government, Washington, D.C. government, they would say thank you. If you paid, thank you. If you say yes, fine. If not, even then, thank you. Primarily because there was no way we could go after those who are not paying any taxes. So my first job as a tax commissioner in Washington, D.C. was to shape up the tax agency so we would collect revenue. And that was a first challenge that I had. And I tell you how the challenge was managed. In the very first few months, while walking around the office, I opened a door to a room and I saw piles of tax returns, unopened tax returns, into bins that were stacked from floor to ceiling, unopened. And when I saw that, my God, any tax agency that neglects its fundamental document, like a tax return, how could it be collecting taxes? So it took me quite a while even to get those returns out and process them. Some of them had checks in them. So we had to basically, make major changes in personnel, in the policies, in the systems. We are operating out of shoeboxes. We have to have computer systems, all that. So after basically clearing up the mess that we had in tax administration, we started collecting taxes. And once that was done, the revenue started coming in and cities started to basically be able to move out of its deficits and started showing surpluses. The first chief financial officer, Tony Williams, who appointed me as a tax commissioner, when he became the mayor, eventually I became the CFO. And that would be my entry into visible politics of Washington, D.C., because there then Washington Post start taking notice of you as to what you're doing, how you're doing, Are you succeeding or not? Etc. So those were the challenges that I had. And basically we moved city from, as the chart showed, from deficit, junk bonds to AAA surpluses. So from $500 million deficit in our fund balance to $1.5 billion surplus when I left the city, it is a $2 billion turnaround. Other cities that have gone through such financial crises like New York, Philadelphia, none has been able to come back as fast as well as we have. And to a great extent, that is the result of having an independent chief financial officer who does not report to mayor or the council, but to Congress, essentially. So this is the only place as a CFO, you can say no to the mayor and can still be in the office that afternoon. Everywhere else, you'll be sitting home. So with that level of independence, with that level of flexibility, you could say that you can't spend money. I was known as Dr. No. One of the chapter of the books say Dr. No. Why? Because all the projects, small and big projects, from road building, library repairs, to building convention center, a $500 million project, or a new baseball stadium, $1 billion project, all that has to have CFO's approval, fiscal sufficiency. If CFO says no, then it can be done. So all that really got me into the public visibility and basically a financial czar of the city. So my sense here is that it is that level of work, involvement into the public affairs is what drove me to Washington. And I was very happy that I came to Washington. Actually, I came to Washington just for a year to do research. I was that time professor at the University of Pittsburgh teaching accounting, came to Washington for a year. But like all those people who come to Washington, I had this Potomac fever, the illusion of doing important things. So I came there for a year and stayed there for 40 plus years. And I'm happy I did.
As public policy students, we can really appreciate your answer to that question, Dr. Gandhi. Thank you so much.
Thank
Our
you.
last question today comes from Ebony. The floor is yours.
Hi. So my question is, in your book, you mentioned you being viewed as a foreigner and a professor and how that caused issues with people's perception of you. Can you talk about how you overcame that?
As a professor, from simplest of the things, when you give bad grades to students, or I was a hard grader, then students would complain. The dean saying that I don't understand Dr. Gandhi, Professor Gandhi, I don't understand him. And so the grade he gave me was not, was not right grade. I should have given better grade. And dean would say, look, I understand him very well. So you better go back and study hard and do your work. At the same time, I must say that the level of discrimination, if you want to call that, is basically relatively less in academia, primarily because in academia, great deal of emphasis is put on research and publication, which is colorblind. You do your work, send it to a journal with the blind referees, professional referees, and they look at the work and say, yes, this is good. So in general, you have professors doing very well in academia. I mean, look at your own. You have Dean Duality. Similarly, the major business schools of this country are run by Indians, Indian business schools. So wherever there is expertise that is critical, you do well. Just imagine, presently, companies like Microsoft, Google, IBM, MasterCharge, they are run by Indian CEOs. So I think what mattered most to me and to many other Indian professors was the technical expertise. And they were very good at that. They are very good at that. And that basically is what made academia as a more favorable place to go. Similarly, where the skills are important, engineering, medicine, when you want a doctor to operate on you, you want one who knows how to operate. There, you're not saying I want a black or white or whatever. Does he or she know what he or she is doing? That's what we want: expertise, skills, and that is why I think you would see many Indians going to this kind of professions and also to academia. Only now, lately, the second generation Indian immigrants, they are going into public affairs, businesses, etc. And now you also even have in politics, right? Vice President of the United States is Kamala Harris, once a senator from California. All right, she is an Indian American. And similarly, there are 4 Indian American congressmen now, and we will have more of them now. And there are roughly 50 plus, I would say close to 100 young Indians working on the Hill in the Congress. Eventually, they would also go into the public affairs and run for elections. But people like us who came here, we did not have the facility of the language, did not have the customary orientation of American life. So we had to narrow ourselves to areas where our technical skill mattered, such as academia or medicine, engineering.
You make a really good point about young Indians coming up in the world and joining politics and getting involved. And so super glad to hear that. I can totally relate with that. But thank you everyone for your questions. We've now reached the conclusion of today's event. Our sincerest thanks to Dr. Gandhi for taking the time out of his busy schedule to be with us today. I cannot stress how inspiring it is to see someone from the same background share their story of struggles and successes. For those interested in purchasing Dr. Gandhi's book, Still the Promised Land, my fellow classmate Utman will share the link to Amazon once again in the chat. Also, we hope you'll join us at our next online event this Thursday, when Dr. Miriam Martinez-Aranda of UC Davis will speak about the impact of ICE surveillance on immigrant communities at a Robert Presley Center of Crime and Justice Studies seminar. You can learn more about UCR public policy events like these by visiting our website, spp.ucr.edu. While you're there, you can also learn about our new upcoming BA MPP program launching in the 2022 fall quarter. We're so glad you could be with us today. We look forward to seeing you at a future SPP event soon. Until then, goodbye.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was our pleasure, Dr. Gandhi. Thank you.